Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, whenever you've decided to view this lecture. This is Advocacy and Social Justice, and I am going to issue a mea culpa before I ever start. Some of this will definitely overlap what you have learned in your cultural competence course, and I recognize that. Hopefully there's not too much overlap, and hopefully the overlap that is there will give you a slightly different lens, a slightly different perspective than you got there. So part of my reason for doing it, but bear with me and we'll get through it. So, talking about advocacy and social justice as mental health counselors, remember that client service occurs within their psychosocial and environmental context. And that can be very, very different from client to client. In point of fact, just an example because it's fresh on my mind, I was dealing with a residential case staffing recently, and one of the counselors there was talking about a young man who had been referred. His mother had had custody before he came into residential care. Mother had never had a stable home environment for him. She had literally lived with the child in her car, couch surfed, been in homeless shelters, but had never ever had a home that she could call her own. And this child was now approximately 9-10 years old. Some of what he was doing was, after seeming to settle in and have a fairly prolonged honeymoon phase in residential, he was beginning to act out, running away, really resisting any kind of efforts to establish rapport with him from any of the staff. And what became clear was that he was really resisting establishing a bond when he knew full well that the Department of Child Services was working to reunify him with his mother. And so he would be returning to a very unstable environment after a few months in residential care. So in point of fact, why get close? Why develop relationships here and put down roots when he was going back to the same homeless environment in which he had been before? When we deal with clients, we need to recognize their environment, their context, and we have to advocate for them based on where they are or where they're going to be. And sometimes that's very, very difficult. All right. At times, as with this client that I just mentioned, mental health counselors end up working with an interdisciplinary team. Your work is not alone, it's not isolated in the individual counseling session or the family counseling session, but it's part of a much larger group. And at other times, mental health counselors need to work with the client needs that can be met and recognize that there are a great number of needs that are not going to be met. And that's the reality of the situation. So, spoiler alert here, this is about networking and the need to be aware of community resources. Whatever you're doing, whatever agency you're with, you do need to be aware of the community resources that are available. Let's talk about an ecological view of counseling, an ecological view of the client, because that's really what it's all about at this point. And I want you to take a situation, and this is an actual situation that occurred for me, at least as far as the client goes, and consider it for a moment. Let's say you're out, you're working for an agency, you're a mental health counselor. Your day consists of a client load. You've got maybe 6 individual sessions. You have a group that you're going to do, and you also have a case conference during that day. So you have 8 of your hours scheduled. One of those hours is an intake of a client who presents with her mother, and the client has turned 18, but the mother has petitioned the court for guardianship. And the court has upheld that request, at least temporarily. But part of that temporary guardianship includes a guardian ad litem. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, a guardian ad litem is a court-appointed supervisor, in essence, who looks at the situation and makes recommendations back to the court. Most of the time, a guardian ad litem is an attorney. It doesn't have to be an attorney, but most of the time it is, who is responsible to supervising the case, and telling the court what's going on. Right? Also, condition of guardianship is that there will be ongoing counseling. And after a certain amount of time, the guardianship will be reviewed and determined whether it needs to be ongoing. So you run overtime before you get to this client. You've got about 50 minutes to spend on an intake before your case conference starts at the next hour. What are you going to do? How are you going to handle this? No easy answers. There's no easy way to handle it, but that's the reality of what happens lots of times, is you've got limited time available, you've got a messy situation, it's going to take more than you can reasonably do in the amount of time allotted to you. So if you're trying to use an individualized, compartmentalized approach, where you're just dealing with the client in front of you, I can guarantee you're going to fail miserably. There are multiple systems influencing this individual. And here, as is so often the case, the first thing you're going to have to decide is who is the client, or who are the clients. You've got the 18-year-old who has been referred for counseling. She is clearly in the mix somewhere as the client. But you've also got her mother, who now has guardianship. She's in the mix somewhere as a client. You've got the court, who has ordered counseling. The court is somehow leaning on you and expecting reports back from you about what's happening in counseling. You've got the guardian ad litem, who is a court-appointed supervisor of everything that's happening in this guardianship, and also has a right to all records and to all knowledge about what's happening in the counseling situation. So who, out of all these people, do you classify as the client, as the primary client? Who are you responsible to? Who are you answering to? Who does confidentiality go to? All of these questions need to be decided. And one of the ways that helps, one of the theories that help sort this out is ecological theory. And it can be used to understand the client and defines 4 different levels of the client in the environment. It's not, I'll give you up front, it's not going to help you decide which of these entities or which of these individuals you're going to make the primary client, or how you're going to stack them so that you decide who's most important. You're still going to have to do that. But ecological theory will help you define the levels of these clients in the environment once you have them stacked. First of all is the microsystem. These are the daily interactions, daily relationships in which the client is influenced by others. So the microsystems are, take for example for your 18-year-old. The microsystems for her are her mother, her friends, other family members. In this particular case, the court system, the guardian ad litem, all sorts of people swirling around. But who are the microsystems that are influencing who she is and how she operates? There is the mesosystem, and that is the systems of microsystems. For example, the systems of friends. If she's working, co-workers. If she's in school, school, and family. So how do these groups of microsystems in the aggregate impact her? What is her friendship system like? Is she well accepted by a group of friends? Does she have a solid group of friends? Is she on the fringe? Is she not well accepted? Is it a delinquent group? Is it an outcast group? Who are they? Within the family, what is her role within the larger family? If she's at work, how do coworkers see her? How is she perceived? You know already within the microsystem how she's perceived to some extent by the guardian ad litem and by the court system. She has a clearly defined role there. So that's less of a concern, but you do want to know, at least to some extent, how others perceive her. So the mesosystem. You have the exosystem, which are interactions between two settings. And this is usually when one doesn't directly include the individual. So for example, the court's involvement with her is very, very powerful. If it weren't for the court, she wouldn't be a guardian of her mother. But the court's direct involvement in her daily life is actually very minimal. So, on the one hand, you've got her mother acting as guardian because the court is there. But you've got her mother as the guardian integrally involved with her and the court peripherally involved. So, those are exosystems, the interactions between those two systems. And then you have macrosystems. Those are overarching levels within a culture or subculture. And those are economic systems, social systems, the broader government. Again, does she have a job? Is she able to be employed? Is she struggling? Is she on disability? Where is she in terms of schooling? Is she in regular classes? Is she in any kind of classes for special education? What is her status? You know, in that macro system, where does she stand? So these are 4 levels of environmental interaction she has. But the client can also interact with each of these levels in 3 different ways. And remember, these levels are also interacting with her. So you've got relationship processes. And these are internalized to the client. How does the client see her relationship to each of these systems? If she's in special education, if she's on disability, how does she perceive that? Is that something that she's ashamed of? Is that something that she accepts as a fact? Is that something that she'd like to eventually work her way out of? Particularly, for example, if she's 18 and on disability. That may be something she has for life. That may be something that's that's reviewed every few years, and she may or may not stay on disability. How does she feel about that? How does she feel about the guardianship? Is this something she fought tooth and nail? Is this something she's resigned to? What's her relationship to these systems and these people? It's easiest to grasp that in terms of the microsystems and the mesosystems, but it also applies to the exosystems and the macrosystems as well. Again, what is her relationship to all of the systems in which she's embedded? How does she perceive it? How does she perceive the economic structure? You know, again, the disability, which I was talking about before. But how does she perceive where she is? What are her long-term goals? What does she see herself doing with her life? Where does she want to be? Does she see her mother having guardianship forever? If she doesn't, how long would she see her mother having guardianship? When would she like for her mother to be through with guardianship? How does her mother feel about that? What does her mother see in the guardianship? Does she see this as long-term? Those kind of questions are important. So at all levels, you're looking at these relationships. the behavior setting, settings that impact the client, the work, school, and home settings, the neighborhood, organizational involvement. Does she belong to a church, to a synagogue, to a mosque, to school, to clubs? Is she a member of the YWCA? Where does she go? How does she spend her time? Right? And then in a community context, her minority and majority status in terms of social rituals and norms and perspectives. And again, friendships will give you some of this. You don't have to ask those questions directly from somebody that may not know how to answer them, but getting a sense of what she and her friends do, what her friends are like, how they spend their time, those kind of things will give you those kinds of answers. What does she do in her leisure time? Right. So that ecological background becomes an important framework to understand her and to understand the system in which she's involved. And then from there to be able to advocate for her in an effective manner. Because you're looking at someone who is presenting for counseling in a guardianship, but what does that really mean? What does she really need? And until you understand the broad parameters of what's going on, you can't provide that treatment. And that's just one example. You'll end up with people who are referred by the Department of Child Services for treatment because they've had their children taken away, or because their children are in the home but they still feel like they need parenting services, because they have emotional issues, for vague and nebulous reasons that really are left to you to sort out and decide, what do I need to do? And it can be frustrating at first to be left with these very vague ideas about why a client is seeing you. But the other side of the anchor points is to be presented with the client and be given very specific guidelines about what you're supposed to achieve, and rapidly discover that those goals that someone else has presented for you are not goals that meet the needs, the social advocacy needs or the treatment needs of this particular client. So a lot of times it's actually better to have somewhat nebulous goals and be able to create your own treatment goals in the process. Okay. Understanding advocacy and social justice. Advocacy is the promotion of well-being of individuals and groups. And that's your first lecture question. What is advocacy? Advocacy is the promotion of well-being of individuals and groups. So social justice is promoting access and equality in the life of a society. And that's particularly true for those who have been systematically excluded. If you're working with clients who are referred to you from Department of Child Services, from probation departments, from parole officers, you're going to get clients who have been, to some extent, systematically excluded. That's going to be these clients. And social justice counseling means that mental health counselors recognize that oppression and privilege and discrimination have impacted the mental health of these clients. The goal of social justice, therefore, becomes a more equal distribution of power and social resources. Now, can you do that? No, obviously not. Nobody's expecting you to do that. But you can empower the individual client to move toward greater justice, greater social justice, to assert themselves, to understand how they can move toward that. And that's what you can do. The family system can be empowered toward greater social justice. You can advocate, you can teach how to advocate for themselves. So that's where this comes in. Right. An aside in that regard, one of the better theories for doing this is feminist therapy. It's a theoretical approach. It is not just for women. I have used feminist therapy as part of an eclectic approach, but for a number of years. And there's a book by Laura S. Brown. It was put out in 2010 by the American Psychological Association called Feminist Therapy. It's an excellent read. It's a short book, but it gives you the nuts and bolts of feminist therapy. And I really recommend that you take some time and read it if you're interested in a simple manner of empowering any client and a theoretical approach that empowers clients. All right? Culturally competent counseling is also an essential component to this. If you're going to empower clients, it's not just a matter of teaching them how to be empowered in terms of the organizations and the agencies, but it's also a cultural issue as well. And I do know this is where I'm really overlapping into what you've already experienced or will experience with cultural competence, but bear with me. All right. Counselors need to be aware of their own cultural biases and values. We all have them. There are our own attitudes and beliefs. What is our cultural heritage? And how does that shape our values? Because we all have it. We all come to it. And our knowledge, in addition to knowing our own cultural heritage, is maintaining an awareness of the impact of oppression, racism, discrimination, and stereotyping. If you can look at me and say, I never have a racist thought, I never discriminate, I never stereotype, and I've never oppressed anybody, then I am deeply concerned that you're out of touch with yourself. Because all of us, to some extent, do those things. All of us do them to a greater or lesser extent. And all of us are more or less aware of the fact that we do them. But we all do those things. Right. In terms of skills then, the mental health counselor seeks out educational and consulting opportunities, training opportunities, to improve on cultural competence. And when we do that, we develop a cultural awareness of the client's worldview and their attitudes and beliefs. And as many mental health counselors, you remain aware of both the positive and negative reactions of the client's worldview. So I have worked with everyone from drag queens to white supremacists. I work with all religious groups. Most of the time, I don't have a problem with that, as long as they're willing to respect where I am. They don't have to accept where I am, they need to respect where I am, and I will respect where they are. One of my stories that I tell, which has been many years ago now, but I was dealing with a drag queen who was fairly flamboyant, and he was not dressed in drag when he was in the office, but it was summertime, and he shaved his arms, shaved his legs so that he looked good in drag, and he was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. And I happened to be seeing him, and he walked out of the office with me and into the waiting room, and sitting there was a white supremacist I was going to see next. And he turned around, looked at me, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Oh my." Because the white supremacist I was seeing was actually a very handsome man. And I just smiled and said, "No." And the drag queen looked very disappointed and said, "No." And I said, "No." And so he walked on by without sitting down and chatting with the white supremacist, which is obviously what he wanted to do. So I got past that one. But seen them all. And I don't agree with them, don't agree with the perspective, but that's what they want. That's where they are. That's not what they're coming to treatment for. Then I'll take it. You know, that's what they want to believe. It's not my place to change them. Okay. In terms of knowledge, mental health counselors have a specific knowledge regarding cultural background, socio-political influence, within-group variation, and identity development of the client population. I don't agree with persons who are white supremacists. I know something about the dynamics of people who become white supremacists. I don't disagree with drag queens, but I know something about the dynamics of people who do drag. I understand the culture, at least to some extent. That doesn't mean I'm out to change them, but it means that I do understand the background and the culture. I have some knowledge. So in terms of skills, when mental health counselors don't have requisite knowledge or skills, they pursue educational resources to attain those skills. Fort Wayne, for all the fact that it's a fairly large city in its way, it's still a fairly small town. There are times when I have the freedom to say, I don't do that, or I don't have that expertise, and I can refer clients on to someone who does. But there are also many situations where I don't really have that freedom. There just are not enough counselors, there are not enough mental health professionals in Fort Wayne who are specialists enough that I can say, you know, really, I don't know enough, my expertise is not great enough, but this person's is, so I'm going to refer you over there. So a lot of times, I end up handling things that I'm really not completely comfortable handling, but I know that short of sending them to Indianapolis or Chicago or Ann Arbor, there's not going to be anyone that can do it better than I can do, at least in terms of background and expertise. So I think you'll find that too as you go along, that there's an opportunity, if you want it, for a wider variety of clients than you ethically might otherwise have, because there are not the resources here that there would be in a larger city. Right. Culturally appropriate intervention strategies. In terms of attitudes and beliefs, we've been talking about you respect beliefs and values, whatever those may be. As long as you have a right to have your beliefs and values respected too. And if a client can't do that, then it may be time to move them on. In terms of knowledge, a mental health counselor recognizes limitations and barriers in the practice. If there are barriers, if there are things that you just can't do, it's okay to refer somebody. For example, sometimes when it comes to an abuse history, if I'm dealing with particularly a female who has a history in a relationship with domestic violence, that's one where at times I really feel like a female does better with a female counselor who can model for her what empowerment as a female looks like. And I will refer on. because I think they have the better chance of really providing the treatment that's needed. All right? It's a reasonable effort to advocate for the best interest of the client. It's not that I am trying to do a dump, as we call it, dump a client onto someone else because I don't want them. But it's that I really genuinely believe that a client is best served by someone else. In terms of skills, mental health counselors remain open to using a variety of communication and helping styles. And depending on which one is most appropriate for the culture, that's the one you use. One of the things that took me a long time to get used to, there are people, and I'm not sure this is any one culture, but it's a background for some people. Some people really prefer to see Dr. Cates. I prefer to be Jim. I really don't prefer to be Dr. Cates to my clients. But there are clients who really want to see Dr. Cates, and so it took me a long time to get used to that and comfortable with it, but I'm okay. If that's who they want to see, that's who they can see. That's what they can call me. I don't always feel comfortable with it, but I'm willing to accept it because that's where they're coming from. All right, social injustice and mental health. Social injustice includes racism, sexism, classism, poverty, child exploitation, educational achievement gaps. It includes violence against racial, ethnic, and sexual minorities. All of those things are social injustice. And I'm going to consider privilege and oppression as broad terms that capture these. So when I'm talking about privilege and oppression here, that's what I'm talking about. Privilege is unearned, and it's often due to an innate characteristic: skin color, socioeconomic status, but for some reason that has nothing to do with what an individual has earned, they have privilege. And they're often unaware. Privileged individuals don't know that they're privileged. So they have social dominance, cultural, social, and economic advantages because of their privilege. Privilege ends up equaling power, and power equals the ability to control people and limit access to resources. Just that simple. Privilege and power are inherent in the counseling relationship as well. And that's your lecture question number 2. Privilege and power are inherent in the counseling relationship. You may not recognize that immediately, but when the client walks in and you say, "How can I help you?" or "What can I do for you today?" or "What brings you here?" or "What services do you need?" or "What's going on?" Any way you phrase it, the minute you say that, there is a power differential in place. And you're saying, "I have a resource that you need." It's not necessarily privilege yet, but it's definitely a power differential. And many, many, many mental health professionals will turn that into privilege because it gives a sense of superiority, because it builds on their need to feel positive about themselves. So privilege is a problem for many people in the mental health profession. Just be aware of that. Remember, at its best, counseling serves as a safe haven. The client can experience non-judgmental interactions and process how her or his behavior is impacting others. But the mental health counselor needs to be aware of that power differential. You don't need to give up the power. And probably you never can fully do so. You're always the one that's getting paid for the service. You're always the one who has the expertise. You're always the one in the driver's seat. But you can empower the client. You can make the relationship more egalitarian. You can make it clear that your purpose is to give them as much power as possible and to see them develop that power. And in so doing, you can also teach them how to deal with oppression. Oppression is one individual or group exercising power to dominate another group. And oppression generally imposes undesirable labels or experiences and conditions on the oppressed group. And remember, one can be a member of a privileged and an oppressed group simultaneously. One can be a gay white male. And that has, at least historically, and still today, the ability to be an oppressor and the oppressed all at the same time. So there are all sorts of dynamics that go into roles of being oppressed and oppressing, depending on where one is, depending on what the situation is. So it's easy to take both sides of the fence. Racism and sexism. Let's talk about those a little bit. Racism, quite simply, is the belief that one's own race is superior to another's. It leads to discrimination and abusive behavior toward other races. And sexism is the belief that one sex is superior to another. And again, it leads to discrimination and abusive behavior. Probably the single most famous case of racism in mental health was perpetrated by the psychologist Arthur Jensen. And that occurred in 1969. He published a paper suggesting that African Americans in general had lower intelligence than whites, and hypothesized that this was genetically based. And it started a firestorm of controversy. And Jensen actually came back at a lot of the controversy and continued to attempt to prove his point, and did so, at least in the early days. The one good thing that came out of Jensen's research was it led to a recognition of the complexity and the intertwining of the issues of poverty and racism. For example, we know that the homicide rate among African Americans is almost 4 times the rate for whites. And that's often quoted as an example of racism. But what makes the statistic more complex is the fact that African Americans are the ones most often committing the homicides. So it's probably better an argument for poverty and disenfranchisement than it is an argument for racism. Right? Poverty is probably an underlying issue. If it is an underlying issue, is it an outcome then of racism? And if so, how do we address this ongoing cycle of racism which creates poverty? Those are some of the interesting issues that come up that nobody has good or simple explanations for. But it's the kind of complexity that occurs. Sexism, for a long time, women were victims of domestic violence. Now we see women fighting back. And women are being charged with domestic violence at much higher rates than ever before. I'm not sure that this is really a good thing, that what women have learned is, okay, I'll just fight back rather than take it from a man. But that seems to be what's happened. Women still make about 80% of the wages of men. Women are still underpaid compared to what men make. That percentage decreases even further for women of color. The exception would be Asian women, who make about 85% of what men make. So, women are also concentrated in mid-level management roles, and less so in high-level management positions. When you go into mental health, and I notice that most of this class is female, when you go into mental health, look at the managers and look at the highest level managers. And many times, men will be in higher level management positions still. Okay. There's also what's called hostile and benevolent sexism. In hostile sexism, men are superior to women and therefore deserving of higher level status and power. It's just a flat out statement. In benevolent sexism, there's a more chivalrous approach. There's an expression of male dominance, but the idea is that it's protective of women, and that's the way it's approached. It's a paternalism that goes on. There's a complementary gender differentiation there. It's almost as if women are the better of sex. There's a heterosexual intimacy. Women fulfill men's romantic needs, but they really can't fulfill other needs. One is equally as damaging as the other, but they're damaging in different ways. You can experience either hostile or benevolent sexism as a mental health counselor. In your employment, though, you're more likely to experience a subtle benevolent sexism, and that's what's more likely to hit you. It was interesting. I was in a Zoom meeting 3 or 4 weeks ago now, and a contentious issue arose. It was me and one other male and probably 5 or 6 women in the meeting. I was not running the meeting. I didn't have status as the leader of the meeting, but neither did the other male. But in this contentious issue, it very quickly became me and the other male who were arguing opposite sides of the issue, who took the lead and were most vocal and clearly taking leadership roles. And my thought as it happened was, it's interesting that watching this, because it's just kind of classic that this would be occurring. Even now in 2020, here we are. We're as males becoming dominant in this situation, and there's no reason for that to happen, but it did. Depending on status, racism or sexism may be a more essential focus for women. For example, if a woman is African American or Hispanic from a marginalized social class, she may be focused more on racism than sexism. But in contrast, if she's from upper class, upper middle class, she may be more focused on the sexism. Depends on where she's coming from. All right. And let's talk for just a minute on advocacy and social justice counseling. Advocacy with versus advocating for, or advocating with versus advocating for a client. Advocating for the client is essential to create a sense of empowerment. But there's a critical consciousness, an awareness of oppression and its impact on the individual community and society. Let me say that again. Critical consciousness is the awareness of oppression and its impact on the individual community and society. On the individual, community, and society, and that's your third lecture question. So as the client increases critical consciousness, they're better able to perceive the world and reject negative messages about their cultural group and themselves. And we don't have to advocate for the client as much as we can advocate with the client. By openly discussing privilege and oppression in the session, we facilitate development of a critical consciousness. We create a positive identity. That's appreciating one's cultural group, not in competition to the dominant group, but for its own merits. Again, positive identity. It's not that African Americans or Hispanics, Latinos, or Burmese, or whoever it may be, are better in comparison with another group. They have a solid sense of their identity because they are themselves, without any need for comparison. And that becomes important in terms of empowering a marginalized group or a member of a marginalized group to see themselves as essential in their own right. So as an individual increases critical consciousness and positive identity, they can be encouraged towards social action. They look beyond themselves at change that affects the family and the community. They look beyond themselves at ways that they can empower their group. And that may not happen in the time you're seeing them as a client. Again, this may be something, an idea that you're planting, an idea that moves forward with them. But hopefully you give them that potential. Okay. Social advocacy, justice. That's a very quick overview. Like I say, you probably heard this in other classes much more in depth. I hope you have. I wish you well, and I'll see you the next time.